Ed here with a Digital Digest, and today I wanted to share my full review, the digitally digested segment, for the Sony A7 Mark III. Now, this camera is priced at $2,000, sold out virtually everywhere, but I'm pretty sure that Sony is in the process of catching up on the back orders, and if you order something now, you'll probably see it somewhere between 2 to 4 weeks, which isn't bad considering, well, if you know Sony's past with trying to keep up with demand when they have brand new launches like this camera, then you already know that isn't too shabby. Now, we're working with a 24 megapixel sensor. The key to the A7 Mark III is that at that $2,000 price, you are getting basically the exact same build quality, form factor, and feature set as the A9. I'm not telling you it's the identical performance because it is not, but in terms of autofocus performance, very close. So while it caps out at 10 frames per second, shoots beautiful 4K video both at 24p as well as 30p, it has coverage on its sensor that is, with phase detection, 93% of the sensor is covered, similarly to that of the $4,500 A9. Now, of course, again, I said it caps out at 10 frames per second. You are not going to see the 20 frames per second or the zero blackout on the EVF. Also, the EVF is downgraded from what you'd get with the A7R Mark II or Mark III or the A9, so keep that in mind. In my opinion, that is the biggest letdown from the A7 Mark III, which, considering all of the camera that you're getting here for $2,000, that still makes it, in my mind, a relative bargain. And that's because, again, you have the new battery type, the FZ100, which is going to yield, Sony claims it's the highest efficiency inside the A7 Mark III, and in my experience, that's been correct. They estimate roughly a little under 700 still images in terms of battery life. Of course, if you're going to shoot still and video, those numbers are going to change, but that average number is higher than what you'll find with the A7R Mark III or the A9. Of course, that has, there are several variables to that, but just something to bear in mind. We have a dual SD card slot, again, part of the redesign that you're getting from the A7R Mark III and A9. One slot UHS 1 compatible, the other UHS 2 compatible. In terms of the touchscreen, functional, still not my favorite, but we do have an actual joystick, something, again, that is part of the redesign from since the A9 was launched. The video button also relocated from where your hand would traditionally rest to the right side of the EVF, much like the A7R Mark III and A9. In my opinion, that's exactly where it belongs. We still don't have a fully articulating display. This is the range you've got. It's not bad, in my opinion, in no way a game changer or a problem or troublemaker for this camera. In terms of I/O ports, all on the left side of the camera does, of course, have Wi-Fi and NFC, as I've stated in previous videos. Play memories has been done away with. Your microphone port, your HDMI port for video out, your headphone jack for monitoring, and last but not least, a USB Type-C for transfer, and micro USB or multi-port, as Sony has always called it, for basically other accessories above and beyond the traditional charging. Now, the A7 Mark III does not come with a dedicated battery charger, so you'll probably want to pick up a generic or a Sony one, entirely up to you. The generics work just the same. I picked up a dual Watson charger, which I do have an unboxing that should be up, and I've already been using it. Love it. It's what I was using before, and frankly, I would have just bought replacement plates for the 100 type batteries, but they're not in stock as of yet. You'll also notice we have no actual mode dial lock on the A7 Mark III, which I think is a good thing. Some people like it, some people hate it. It's really a matter of personal preference. But overall, you have plenty of customization here. Front dial, rear dial, C1, C2, you've got C3, and just jumping into the menus relatively quickly, which I do want to do. Remember, 10 frames per second, with the autofocus prowess, just about the same prowess that you'll get in the A9, which is very impressive. Now, if I quickly jump into the menu, you will see, and I'm just going to go through this quickly so you can just see what is under the hood in terms of the actual UI when you step into the A7 Mark III. It's pretty extensive, and that's because this is a beast of a $2,000 full-frame camera. In fact, there is nothing on the market that competes with this in any shape or form, and that's what makes it incredibly unique. That's why my biggest gripe with it right now is really, again, that EVF, because once you've used the A9 or the A7R Mark III, or even the A7R Mark II, which had a superior EVF to what we have here, it's tough to look at. Now, is it bad enough that I wouldn't recommend the camera? Absolutely not. This really all comes down to whether or not, like myself, you have been spoiled. If you have not been spoiled, no reason basically to even consider walking away. You do have high frame rate shooting as well. For those of you wondering, you can see right there, 30p, 120 frames per second. You can bump it up to 60, but not at 120 frames per second. You'd have to be at 60 frames, I'm fairly certain. So that is your slow motion capability. This is not a new feature, but still a relevant one. Moving along, I mentioned the video quality. It is outstanding. Now, is it as good as my A7R Mark III? I don't think so, but I've seen plenty of people making the argument that it is. No overheating issues with this. I've been shooting predominantly with the Sony 24-105, which is a dream lens for you travelers out there. Yes, it did have some production issues, but all of that aside, it is still a beast. And then the other monster I've been using is this bad boy right here, which of course is Sony's old, it's a couple years old now, PZ 28-135 f4G lens. I'm getting ready for a big trip, and I wanted to have the best of both worlds, and at least right now, those two lenses seem to represent exactly that. I will be doing a separate video on the gear I'm taking on that trip, some insight as to where I'm going. But again, back to the A7 Mark III. It really just does everything right. Outside of the EVF, there are some striping issues. If you're not familiar with that, this was known prior to the release in DP Review's own review of the camera, the sample images. It illustrated, showed it. Now, Sony isn't the only one to have this issue. Nikon has had it in the past. And what I would say to you on that is that it might be because Nikon gets a lot of their sensors from Sony. But either way, if you're not familiar with striping, that can easily be resolved in post. So it is not something that should push you away from this camera, in my opinion. Should it be there? No, I'm not qualifying striping as being okay, but I do not think that it should, again, make you not want this piece of gear, because at this price point, I will reiterate, you will find nothing like the A7 Mark III. The 5-axis stabilization works just as it should, similarly to that of the A9 and the A7R Mark III and the A7R Mark II. Would I like to still have play memories? Sure, but Sony has ditched that since they've gone towards focusing on professionals, and I understand why. Play Memories application store was really built around trying to get general consumers, and since Sony knows most general consumers who are not really prosumers, professionals, hobbyists, enthusiasts, are going to rely on their smartphone, which, thankfully for Sony, they make the majority of the sensors for those as well. So, especially Apple. So for all the iPhone users out there, yeah, you're shooting with a Sony. But that aside, the A7 Mark III just does it all. I cannot tell you, besides the striping and my personal gripe with the quality of the EVF, anything else that there is to dislike. This camera just does everything that you could want. Traditionally, at this price point, you'd be looking at a Micro Four Thirds or APS-C camera, probably from Panasonic, which they've made competent products for a long time. They're the only other company that I truly respect other than Sony for pushing the envelope. But what Sony's done here now is shake up the entire industry, because now standards have to change accordingly. If you've got a camera at $2,000 that has 93% of its sensor covered, 10 frames per second, fantastic UHD video, fantastic battery life, which it does. I mean, throw a vertical grip on this thing and you're good to go. You're not going to find yourself looking for batteries on the same day. I mean, I'm not going to say that that's impossible. If you're doing, event photography, always have more batteries. I shouldn't need to tell you. The more, the merrier. But overall, this camera just checks every box. And I think it is the camera to own right now for just about everyone out there who's on the fence. You can see the startup screen there. On the fence, trying to figure out what is right for them at $2,000. Now, I have compared this to the A7R Mark II, and my video was pretty clear. If you need the extra resolution, if you're doing landscape, still life, very large prints, you need the extra resolution, you should pick up the A7R Mark II. They're the exact same price. The A7R Mark II is still a fabulous camera, but overall, all of the niceties, the remodel, the rebuild, as it really has been from the ground up in terms of design, battery type, and most importantly, that autofocus system does differentiate the A7 Mark III very clearly. If you need those things, this is the camera for you. So if 24 megapixels is enough, look no further. Now, one comparison that I have not done, which I may or may not do, is to the A6500, because even though they, again, are different types of cameras, one being APS-C, this being full frame, they are, again, close in pricing, and both take E-mount glass, whether you're working with full frame or APS-C E-mount. Of course, I always recommend buying full frame glass because you never know when you're going to migrate, and the A7 Mark III is that perfect example. So if you've been following my channel over the years and heard my recommendations to stick with full frame glass, then you're probably happy that you have, because along has come this $2,000 dream camera outside of the small issues that I've mentioned. And when I say small, they really are. Is it the right camera for me personally? Well, I own the A7R Mark III and I have no intent of getting rid of it. In spite of the improved autofocus on this camera, I found the improved autofocus to only be slightly better. If autofocus is really what you're after, the A9 is where you should be headed. But granted, that camera is $4,500. But by picking this versus the A7R Mark III, you've got enough money to pick up one of these bad boys, which I think is worth every penny. Another review for another time. So the A7 Mark III, I almost said R Mark III, really does it all. Does it at an affordable price, ounce for ounce, pound for pound. You will not find a better camera than this on the market right now. There are better cameras, but for more money, again, for your dollar, this is the best piece of kit on the market. So I've mentioned my own personal gripes in my use with it. I think they're incredibly minor. I expected to have more complaints, because at $2,000, it did seem too good to be true. Of course, you don't have an Ethernet port like the A9. You don't have a flash sync like the A7R Mark III. But for $2,000, you have everything that you could possibly need pretty much as a pro or a hobbyist or an enthusiast, and then some. And I think this is the killer camera for Sony, because even though I've given high praise to the A9 and the A7R Mark III, those clearly aren't going to hit as broad a market as the Sony A7 Mark III. And that's because that $2,000 price point, affording all of this capability, and then leaving over budget for lenses, or a lens, I should really say, because if you pick up something like the f4 24-105, then you're right at the price of an A7R Mark III. Forget about, if we were to compare this to the A9, you've got room for yet another fantastic lens, maybe even a single, just a G Master if you want to pair that with this. So the A7 Mark III has everything going for it. Wish the EVF was better, wish the striping wasn't there, but when you look at everything else that this camera is capable of, how can you really complain? I mean, this is a home run for Sony, and it's because it has such a broad appeal, And of course, if you want to pair this with Legacy, Nikon, Canon, whatever glass you have, Minolta, you can. Will you need an adapter? Yes, but because of that 5-axis stabilization that Sony's implemented a while back, you're not going to have really any issues. So that's another really nice thing. Of course, Metabones is where you should be looking in that case. Not getting into that today in this video. But again, I will reiterate, very happy with the A7 Mark III. It's not going to be my personal choice for the trip I'm about to embark on, because I'm sticking with my A7R Mark III, because I just love having nearly double the photographic information there on the sensor. It just gives cropping capability that I cannot get out of this. But that again comes down to, do you need that? Most people out there, most of my subscribers I find, do not need it. But of course there are those of you that are looking for that. And of course the A7R Mark II or III is where you will find it, and you know the differences. I've detailed that in many, many videos. So again, you will not be dissatisfied. I can say that wholeheartedly with the A7 Mark III. $2,000, very well spent. Worked well with every lens I tested it on, which includes Zeiss 24-70 f4, the Zeiss f4 16-35, the Zeiss f4 70-200, the G Master 100-400, as well as the two lenses I just showed you before. So this has really been put through the paces. Again, I'm just spoiled by the EVF and the striping, and that really is the takeaway from today's review. You've got a monster camera at a price that cannot be beat, and I have absolutely no reservations recommending this to anyone out there who's just beginning or looking to upgrade from APS-C or possibly a previous generation A7. Don't look back. Make the move. You will thank yourself. Trust me. Again, if you need the extra resolution, you know you should be getting the A7R Mark II. But otherwise, you will have no regrets, because even my mention of, or mentioning my personal disappointment with the EVF, if you haven't shot with those cameras, you're still going to think this EVF is great, because it is not bad. It's good. It's just not as good as Sony's next level of pro gear. So a great camera, great price. Kudos to Sony for getting this right, because I think this is where the mass turnover, the defection, if you will, from Canicon truly begins. But that pretty much covers everything that I have to say about the A7 Mark III. Love it, but it's not going to be what I'll be leaning on for my trip that I'm about to embark on. Any questions or comments, please feel free to post them. Hit that like button, and as usual, please feel free to subscribe. Later.